classes we began with Hatikva, especially since we're studying the rise of the State of Israel. The first time we played only the second of the 2 times Hatikva ever was played at the Olympics. Last time we began with the first time Hatikva ever was played in an Arab country. We begin today, first of all, with having played the second of the 2 times Hatikva was ever played at the Olympics. Today, the first time the Hatikva ever was played at the Olympics. And then we go straight into class. Israel won at that time in, 2004, in Athens. Israel won the windsurfing gold medal. That was its first gold medal in the Olympics.
גל פרידמן על הפודיום.
médaille d'or et champion olympique représentant Israël.
Gold medal and Olympic champion representing Israel, Gal Friedman.
גל פרידמן מישראל על הפודיום, מדליית זהב במיסטרל אתונה 2004. לכל אורך הדרך, גל פרידמן אמר, גם גור שטיינברג, גם יהודה מעיין אמרו, מדליית זהב זו המטרה. גל פרידמן הגולש היחיד מבין כל הגולשים בתחרות שסיים את כל השיוטים בעשירייה הראשונה, ואחרי ההישג הזה, מדליית זהב זה בהחלט ראוי לה.
Κυρίες και κύριοι, ο εθνικός ύμνος του Ισραήλ.
Mesdames et messieurs,
עכשיו, התקווה ודגל ישראל בראש שלושת הדגלים.
The national anthem of Israel.
גל פרידמן על דוכן המנצחים באתונה 2000.
Now, last week, we began with Jews in Great Britain, and I was showing you how there they were singing God Save the Queen and Hatikva in a shul with then Prince Charles in the shul. And then we followed with that Adon Olam sung by a Jewish yeshiva choir, chorus of several hundred kids in honor of King Charles's coronation. And then I said, but the relationship of the Jews in England wasn't always that way. And we went back. And that's kind of what I'm going to do today. I want to take us to the Kotel, as it were, for Birchat Kohanim, on a Jewish festival. I don't recall whether it was Sukkot or Pesach. And to take a look at the Kotel in Jewish hands, where Kohanim can do the blessing on the Chag, and hundreds and thousands of Jews can be at the Kotel for the blessing. And then I'm going to go into our class, which is to begin with the words, it wasn't always that way at the Kotel. So here we go. Let's just fix the sound a bit from my end. Thank you, Alan. All right.
Out here at the Western Wall in Jerusalem this morning, tens of thousands gathered here as we see behind us at the Kotel for the priestly blessing Birkat Kohanim. It happens only twice a year, once during the festival of Passover, Pesach, and once during the festival of Sukkot. The priestly blessing, of course, administered in Jewish services every day, but this is a special gathering that happens twice a year here at the Western Wall. A tradition started in the late 1960s during the War of Attrition. Rabbi Menachem Begin wanted to give extra blessings, extra feeling of safety and security to the people of Israel, and started this tradition here. Tens of thousands of Jews and tourists as well are gathered here to receive the blessing here today, the oldest blessing in the Jewish faith, started by Aaron, the original high priest. Quite a scene here at the Western Wall this morning. The Jewish people pray for the end of rain during the holiday of Passover. They didn't quite get their wish today. It rained early on, but it didn't appear to deter anybody from getting here today. We see the throngs, the crowds, all the way back through the gates here at the Western Wall Plaza, up the steps leading into the Jewish quarter as well.
It wasn't always thus. In the previous classes, we've talked about how the British prevented prevented ships from coming into Haifa and caused, actually in association with the Nazis, even though they were fighting the Nazis, they caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Jews, if not millions of Jews, because those Jews had gotten out and had nowhere to go. Roosevelt would not let them into America, et cetera, et cetera. But to a certain degree, Jews cannot expect that they're going to get a good break from the outside world. But there was the land of Israel. Yet the British would not let the Jews in. And we studied together about the Patria and the Struma and the Exodus and other ships that they kept out. Secondly, we've studied how the British truncated the land of Israel. How they took 78% of the land of Israel and they cut it off and they made a country, Jordan. And then of the remaining 22%, they again cut a substantial amount out. So by the time 1947 rolled around and the state of Israel was created, the country already had been substantially truncated into something much smaller. And this is why the British had to be thrown out. But there was more. We learned last class about the massacres, the Arab pogroms, the Arab riots like in Hebron in 1929, Yerushalayim in 1921. There were others, Shechem and otherwise in 1936 to 1939, and just an ongoing phase of Arab terrorist riots. Long before there was a state of Israel, when people talk about where the Arabs say, you know, we're angry because of the Jewish country, we want Palestine, they say, we went back and we looked at what it was like before there even was an independent Jewish country. It was all the same terrorism, the same massacres, in fact, much worse. You don't really have massacres of 69 yeshiva students in one shot now that there's an independent Jewish state that can fight them, can fight back, and even can target assassinations of their leaders. So those were three issues, that the British were blocking the ports, truncating the land, and not protecting Jews in the face of terrible Arab riots, and even arresting Jews who had guns to try to defend themselves. They made it illegal for Jews to have the guns. But fourthly, the fourth of the four things is that they repressed and suppressed Jewish rights in the land of Israel. And the one that we're focusing on right here is the Western Wall, the Kotel HaMa'aravi, which they called, and many still do, the Wailing Wall. Wailing as in crying, the Jews crying at their wall. We don't call it the crying wall, we call it the Western Wall of the Beit HaMikdash compound. At the Kotel HaMa'aravi, when we were not sovereign as a Jewish people over the land, you just saw what it's like when the Jews were sovereign. Tens of thousands gathered for Birchat Kohanim on Pesach. When Jews were not sovereign, it was illegal for Jews to gather for religious purposes at the Western Wall, and the British actually arrested people. Particularly, it was illegal to blow the shofar at the Western Wall. Let's see. So I remind you, first of all, these were the Palestine police for whom the British advertised. We covered it last week. They had their two kinds of uniforms. The leading commanding officers wore uniforms like that. The men in the field wore uniforms like that. And in England, they advertised, be a Palestine policeman for a career. And part of the job of the Palestine policeman was to prevent this, to prevent Jews from blowing shofar at the Western Wall.
On Yom Kippur of 1930, 26-year-old Moshe Segal blew the shofar at the Kotel at the end of Ne'ilah, Yom Kippur's closing prayer. He was promptly arrested and taken to jail, still fasting. What was his crime? Under British law in Palestine, Jews were forbidden to blow the shofar at the Kotel, pray loudly there, or bring Torah scrolls so as not to offend the Arab population. For the next 18 years, the shofar was sounded at the Kotel every Yom Kippur. Shofars were smuggled into the Kotel where brave teenagers defiantly blew them at the conclusion of the fast. Some managed to get away. Others were captured and sent to jail. Echoes of these inspiring acts reverberated throughout the Jewish world.
הטילו עליי עם עוד שני בחורים לתקוע בשופר ביום כיפור.
העמידו אותנו מהראש לקיר, מאחורינו היה מישהו שנתן פקודה שחייבים לתקוע בשופר ושאל מי מכם מתמחה ויכול לעשות את זה. אני הרמתי את היד, אמרתי אני.
אתה תהיה הראשי, והם במקרה ונכשלת או נתפסת, שיתקעו את השופר. אז הוא אומר, מה עם ההורים? הרי אתה תיאסר. אמרתי, אין אמא, אין אבא, זאת אומרת, בסדר.
שאל אותי, אתה מוכן ללכת לפעולה הזאת בכותל המערבי ולהיעצר? אמרתי לו, הולך. בסדר גמור. אנחנו נשבענו להקריב את חיינו לתקומת העם היהודי.
במשך ימים היינו נוסעים להתאמן להחזיק את השופר.
The last 6 shofar blowers still alive returned to the Kotel, the scene of their crime, where they recounted their individual stories and sounded the shofar again at the wall.
כל הזמן חשבתי לך, לא רק היום.
כל מחכסתי?
נאימון.
These men battled the British Mandate, fought in several wars, built families and homes, and saw their dream of a Jewish state realized. Yet over 60 years later, that Yom Kippur they blew the shofar is still one of the defining moments of their lives.
באה בחורה, באה עם ילדה, ואמרו לי שהם לוקחים אותי לכותל. איפה השופר? אצל הילדה.
בדרך לעיר עתיקה יש שם שער להיכנס לרובע היהודי. הבריטים יצאו שם, אמרו, אין דרך ללכת לכותל, גמרנו.
לא ידענו שיסגרו את הכניסה לכותל. עברנו ממרפסת למרפסת ברובע היהודי, קפצנו מגינה לגינה.
והגענו לכותל.
איפה שנכנסים לכותל היה שם העמדה של המשטרה. היה המון שוטרים.
הוא היה קיר גדר, ועמד שוטר, ואני זוכר את המספר שלו. היו שם בריטים גבוהים, הביאו במיוחד, שהסתכלו מעל הקהל.
The British police officers did not speak Hebrew. Messages were secretly delivered to the Jews gathered at the Kotel, disguised as prayers.
אני פתאום רואה שוטר חרש. אמרתי לכאן, תזהרו משוטר החרש, שהוא נמצא ביניכם.
אומרים, עננו, יש לנו מרגל, עננו, כולכם תדחפו אותו, עננו. כמה דקות לפני התקיעה היית רואה שהשוטרים והצבא מתחיל לנוע בפנים, כי הם יודעים עוד דקה, 2 דקות, זה מגיע.
עמד על ידי בן אדם דתי מציצית, והעביר לי את השופר, הוא כיסה את עצמו שאני לא אראה אותו, הם יתפסו אותי, שאני לא אגיד ממנו. הפעולה התבצעה בצורה כזו, 3 בחורים, מצד ימין אחד, מצד שמאל אחד, באמצע אחד. אני הייתי פה במקום הזה.
והתחילו לשיר שנה הבאה בירושלים, אז לקחתי את השופר ותקעתי.
ברגע שמצד ימין התחיל לתקוע, אז כל השוטרים היו רצים לכיוון ההוא, ואז צד שמאל תקע. ואז האמצע תקע.
רק התחיל להוציא הפרה מהשופר, וכל הצבא וכל האנשים וכל זה התחילו לרוץ שם בכיוון שלו, ואני ראיתי כולם נוהרים לשם ודוחפים לשם. פתחתי בשופר תקיעה ככה על הכיפאק.
ברגע שתקענו והיה מהומה, התחילו מכות עם עלות.
דחפו את כל הציבור בכוח עצום, רצו למי שתוקע בשופר. התחילה שירת התקווה ובאו לתפוס אותי לחבבתי. עמד לידי הקצין לנגר. אמר לי, תזוז מפה, תלך מהר, תלך. איך שזה קרה, תפסו אותי. הבלתי צעק באנגלית שתפסנו אותו. שני שוטרים היו, צד אחד שוטר וצד שני שוטר. איך שאנחנו התחלנו ללכת, המון אנשים אחריי. ניגש מישהו אחריי בעברית, אמר לי, אל תפחד, אנחנו נשחרר אותך. תשים לב לשירה. התחילו לשיר, נשחרר אותך, נעשה דחיפה, תנסה לקפוץ. מאות אנשים אחרינו. פתאום צעקו שוס, כולם עשו איזו דחיפה ענקית עליי ועל האנגלים. רגע אחד הרגשתי שפחות מחזיק, הצלחתי להשתחרר, קפצתי. אז ברחתי במרכז העיר, חיכה לי יהודי אחד בשם משה סגל. הוא היה התוקע הראשון.
תקעתי בכל הכוח שלי. כשגמרתי, שלפתי את השופר מהפה, נתתי לשוטר שהוא הקיף אותי, סבל בריטי, הוא לקח את השופר.
תפס אותי, הוביל אותי עם עוד כמה אנשים ששרו התקווה לקיש, והייתי כל היום אחרי צום.
כל מה שאני זוכר שם שהייתי רעב מאוד. לא חשבתי על שופר ולא על מה יעשו לי, הייתי רעב, פשוט רעב.
אני סירבתי לאכול, אמרתי אני לא אוכל. אני עצום, אני אמות פה, אני לא אוכל אם אני לא הולך הביתה.
בכסלו הייתי שבועיים ימים, אחר כך למשפט.
All the shofar blowers that were captured were tried and punished under British law. Some were sent to jail for up to 6 months. In the War of Independence in 1948, the Jordanian Legion captured the entire old city of Jerusalem, including the Kotel.
שלא יכולנו לבוא לכותל, היה לי כאב, ממש יום.
אבל גדול לידע עלינו, אבל גדול.
For 19 years, not a single Jew stepped foot at the Kotel, not to mention blew the shofar, until it was liberated by Israel in the Six-Day War in 1967.
במלחמת 6 הימים, אמרתי לחבר'ה, בואו ניכנס לכותל. ועצרנו, נכנסנו לכותל, הייתי מדהים. אני רואה מישהו עם שופר, אמרתי לו, אני מבקש את השופר, תן לי רגע. הסתכל עליי, אומר לי, כך. אני תוקע תקיעה כזו חזקה, בא אליי בן אדם, אומר לי, מה לך ולתקיעה בשופר? אמרתי לו, אני הייתי האחרון ב-47. הוא אומר לי, אני הייתי הראשון ב-31. הרב סגל חיבק אותי, מה זה? ונפרדנו לשלום.
I'll bet you didn't know that. They wouldn't let us blow the shofar at the Western Wall. That's why I began today's session with tens of thousands of Jews at the Kotel Maravi for Berchat Kohanim, the blessing of the Kohanim on Pesach. That's what it was. And that's what Jews faced. And that's why the British had to go. But the British wouldn't leave. The British had an empire. You learned this probably in high school, that the expression that the sun never set on the British Empire, because they had possessions all over the world as part of their colonialism. They were in India, they were in, I think, Pakistan, certainly we know in the Middle East, and they were all over the place, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia, and all over the world, the British had possessions, and they had no intention of leaving any of them. And there were different approaches to what are we going to do. Last week, we learned about Jabotinsky. And Jabotinsky's approach was we have to throw them out. We have to fight them and we have to blow them out if we have to. You recall that Jabotinsky was sent into exile by the British in 1921. During the Arab riots of Yerushalayim, Jabotinsky organized the defense, and Jews saved their lives by defying the British and taking guns and fighting back. And the British arrested the Jews who had been defending themselves, and their leader, Jabotinsky, whom they sentenced, I believe, to 15 years, and is a compromise because there was a world outcry even among Jabotinsky's political enemies among the Jews. How can you put this man in jail for 15 years? He saved lives. And as a result, they exiled him. They said, okay, he won't sit, but he'll never be allowed back into the land of Israel. And as we learned last week, he ultimately died in New York State, 1941, traveling all over the world. He went around Europe in the 1930s to Poland, and he urged and begged Jews to get out of Europe. He said, Jews, a fire is burning. Extinguish the galut, the exile, before the exile extinguishes you. And Jewish leaders in Poland condemned him. You're spreading panic and you're driving people crazy. It's safe here in Poland. We're staying in Poland. They're not going to do any of the things you're describing. And of course, they did everything he predicted. He was a prophet, not a religious prophet. I'm not going to call him a Navi, but he was prophetic in his seeing what was going to happen. So the Jews had to throw the British out. And we needed that background to understand where we're going now in our class on the history of the rise of the Jewish state. Because Jews did some nasty things, really nasty things. And the British called it terrorism. So it's so very important to understand the context. Trying to drive out the people who closed down the harbors, who broke apart the land down to just a fraction of what it was supposed to be, who arrested people for trying to blow a shofar at the wall, and who wouldn't protect us. It led to the rise of the Haganah and the even more intense opposition, the Irgun, which believed in outright attack, and then the Lechi, Lochamei Cherut Yisrael, whom the British called the Stern Gang because they were led by Avraham Stern, and they believed particularly in assassinations. Here we go. You may remember Walter Cronkite, some of us. He, after his retirement from CBS, he was doing documentaries, 10-minute documentaries, and this is one of them.
Throughout the 20th century, post-war independence movements across the globe in Kenya, Malaysia, Vietnam, all used campaigns of terror in their struggles to end colonial rule. And the Jewish state of Israel was born of violence too, in part at the hands of groups that use the tactics of terror. One of these groups was known as the Irgun. Yosef Nachmias joined the Irgun when he was 15, becoming part of the armed resistance that was surfacing in the region.
I had no choice. I had to fight. I had to take arms. Otherwise, I won't have a free state as I've got it today.
Their aim, to force out the British, who ruled the area then known as Palestine, that was heavily populated by Arabs, and create a Jewish state. The Irgun actually had formed in the early 30s as an underground movement. It advocated armed struggle against the British, who earlier in the century had committed to creating a homeland for the Jews. Their objectives gained new urgency following World War II and the Holocaust. Thousands of Jewish refugees from Europe surged toward Palestine, straining the already fragile relations between Arabs and Jews. The British response was to close the borders to the influx.
They used to come towards the Mediterranean and to the shores of Eretz Israel. The British won't let them in. They'll send them back to high seas at the beginning. And many of our brothers were drowned after they escaped from Europe. They were drowned because the British won't let them in. And that's the reason that we thought that we must fight the British.
made the resistance movements even more determined.
We used to smuggle arms inside fish barrels. There was salted fish barrels, and they used to bring it to my parents' house. My mother used to open and clean the weapons and all, and then they'll take it out. There were German weapons, Italian weapons, from all kinds. Whatever could shoot, this would be all right for us.
The leader of the Irgun was a young Polish refugee named Menachem Begin. Begin advocated violence against the British authorities in Palestine using guns, bombs, and fear. It was a calculated move.
Almost all terrorist campaigns before those in Palestine in the 1940s were localized affairs. But the Jewish terrorists went a step beyond that, and they played to an audience far beyond the footprints of the, let's say, the locus of conflict. But firstly to London, they played directly to the capital to try to influence public opinion further afield in a means to achieve their aims. They also, and I think fascinatingly, played to an audience in New York because the nascent United Nations had just been organized. And their acts of violence were directed or communicated at diplomats designed to put pressure on Britain.
Begin believed that if the resistance could destroy the will and prestige of the British authority, they would depart, leaving the land of Israel to the Jews. Most in the Jewish resistance appealed to the Irgun to stand down. They wanted a diplomatic solution.
The Irgun were described as terrorists not just by the British, who were their enemies, but also by the Jewish community. The focus of their attacks was primarily the British government, its servants, its security forces in Palestine. And they concentrated in the main against British military, intelligence, and governmental targets, not against British civilians.
Begin's Irgun began to plan a major operation against a symbol of British power, the King David Hotel in Jerusalem.
King David Hotel was the headquarters of the British Army and the British regime in Israel. They're going to find out that there is a pillar in the cellar on the southern part, on the south end of the hotel. If there's an explosion there, all the southern part of the hotel will be demolished. We started scouting the place, and we find out that every morning there's a truck coming from Ramallah with milk containers. We decided this is the way we're going to go in.
The Irgun claims that its violence was aimed at British symbols and that it often warned targets to evacuate before an attack to minimize civilian casualties. Whether a warning went out on the morning of July 22nd, 1946 is still unclear.
We waited for that truck from Ramallah. We overcome them. We took the containers out. We put a milk container, but instead of milk there was explosives. And our guys, they were disguised as Arabs, and they went immediately to the King David Hotel. 22 minutes after we left the place, there was a big explosion, and as planned, all the southern part was demolished, but unfortunately, people died there.
91 people were killed, most of them Arabs. 28 of the dead were British. It was the deadliest operation of its time. The British were stunned, but unyielding. They clamped down on the Irgun, hanging Jewish militants in an effort to deter further violence. The Irgun responded with their own form of terrorist justice.
There are two British sergeants in the British intelligence. We kidnapped them, we sentenced them to death, and we told the British they'll hang our guy, we'll hang those two sergeants. And we hanged those two sergeants in one of the forests there.
The small and the weak, and at that time we were the small and the weak, are allowed to do some things that the strong and the powerful cannot do. And this is the critical difference. If you are small and weak, then necessity has no bounds, and people will forgive you for almost anything. If you are big and strong, then of course you always have the choice. You can either choose to fight or not to fight.
Ultimately, the British chose not to fight. And while there were many factors involved in their final decision to leave, the violence perpetrated by the Jewish resistance accelerated that decision. On May 14, 1948, the new state of Israel was proclaimed.
What I did then, I fought for my country, which was given to me by God. Sometimes in war, even a civilian here and there get hit. I won't call it violence, I call it defending myself. It was necessary to fight just to liberate my country, and that's why I took arms and fought the British.
Probably the Irgun's lasting legacy on the general field of terrorism that goes beyond just the creation of Israel is that Begin himself, he understood the power of the media in transmitting a message. And this was a lesson I think almost every terrorist movement worth its salt since the 1940s has absorbed: the power of communication, the importance of reaching an audience outside the immediate locus of conflict, and transmitting a message as a means to marshal support, apply pressure on your enemy, but also as a means to try to spin the publicity one obtains from violence into a form of attention, then recognition, then respectability, then legitimacy, and then hopefully coming to power.
In fact, the man who marshaled support and gained publicity from violence would later become Prime Minister of Israel and be hailed as a peacemaker. Menachem Begin shared the 1978 Nobel Prize with Egypt's Anwar Sadat for the making of peace between Israel and Egypt. The Irgun's legacy would be a model for liberation movements that followed. In the 1950s, the bloody Algerian struggle for independence from the French.
Latest outrage in Jerusalem has been the attack on the house.
And so what we've seen is that the Irgun was created and proceeded with attacks to drive the British out and make it impossible for the British to stay. And I've gathered together a number of film clips, short clips that I was able to locate of terrorist activity that was, or liberation activity that was picked up on film, and that's part of the British archives. But before I go there, I want to jump ahead a little to show you two little clips of the same Menachem Begin years later. By the way, you did catch that the State of Israel on its secular birthday was declared May 14, 1948. That means today is the 75th anniversary. Normally, Israel speaks in terms of the 5th of Iyar, the Hebrew calendar date. It was May 14th, which is, of course, today. I'm going to jump ahead just for a moment, then we're going to come back to two clips, as I said. In one, you see a Begin about, maybe 50 years, well, not 50, but maybe 30 years later. He still has the fight in him. And then his second clip is Begin explaining to the Knesset why he's ready to make a peace agreement with the Egyptians and Sadat. And you see the very complex personality he was, ready to fight. And in a situation where he thought peace could be brought that would make a difference, why he was ready to make peace. Let's take a look, and then we'll come back to some of these clips both this week and next week. But let's see what we can find here. Okay. In the first case, the Chancellor of Germany, I believe it was Willy Brandt, it might have been Helmut Schmidt, was urging the State of Israel to give up territory to Arafat, the so-called two-state solution, which we learned by now would be like 4 states. They've been given so much. And Begin was explaining what he intended to tell the Chancellor of Germany if the Chancellor of Germany were to say to him, that Israel should give up land to Arafat.
וזה מייעץ לי, הצ'אנסלר הגרמני, הוא יודע מה ביטחוננו ואני לא. אני הופקדתי על ידי העם לשמור על ביטחונו. זו חובתי הקדושה. והוא נותן לי עצות לכל אירופה ולכל העולם, איך להכריח אותנו לקבל מדינה פלסטינית, הרי זה מעשה איבה שלא היה כמוהו. וממי הוא בא? מבנו של העם הנושא באחריות בעד רצח שליש מן עמנו, 6 מיליונים, דבר שלא קרה מאז האלוהים ברא את האדם והאדם יצר את השטן. הוא ייתן לנו עצות איך לשמור על ביטחוננו, הוא יפקיר את דמנו, הוא ינהל תעמולה למען מדינה פלסטינית. אז כשאדון שמיט, צ'אנסלר, נו, תסלחו לי רבותיי, אני באתי מן המחתרת הלוחמת, אני לא מפחד מפני אף אחד, אני אומר לו את האמת בפניו, אין לי שום סיבה לפחד, אנחנו ראינו את המוות לעינינו כל יום. אז כשהוא אומר דברים כאלה אני לא אשיב לו? אינני יודע מה שקרה עם עמי, אינני יודע מה שקרה עם משפחתי, אינני יודע מה שקרה עם אחותיכם ואחיכם? מה, אינני יודע? הוא אחרי כל אלה יאמר לנו תקימו מדינה פלסטינית? כלומר, תעמידו את 3.5 מיליון היהודים בארץ ישראל בסכנת מוות וכיליון? ואני לא אשיב לו? השיבותי לו. כמו שצריך, ידידי. אני לא מוותר אפילו על מילה אחת ממה שאמרתי. ואם יש כמה יפי נפש שככה החילו להקם את האף שלהם, יהיה להם אף עקום.
So that's one side of Begin. That's one side of Begin. And this is the other side, speaking and also addressing those in the Knesset who opposed his decision to make a peace agreement with Saddam.
כן, יש קשיים בשלום, יש מכאובים בשלום, יש קורבנות למען השלום, כולם עדיפים מקורבנות המלחמה. את זאת אני מכריז, מי שעמד בראשו של ארגון לוחם. אני אספר לכנסת על מחשבה אנושית פשוטה מאוד, מדוע שלא אתחלק עמם ברע. שברתי רגל, ובאחד הימים או הלילות, אינני יודע, עלתה לי מחשבה כזו. אוי, אם תפרוץ מלחמה, 10, אולי 100 צעירים שלנו ישכבו במיטה עם רגל שבורה או בלי רגל חלילה. צריך למנוע מלחמה.
So we come back now to the clips that I had of some of the Irgun attacks back in the 1940s. And here we go.
Latest outrage in Jerusalem has been the attack on the house of General Sir Evelyn Barker, the Palestine CNC. Barrack buildings were also attacked with explosives, causing much damage but no casualties. Meanwhile, guards are doubled in case of further attempts on the lives of those in authority. Meanwhile, terror descends once again on Palestine as a new wave of violence sweeps the country. Gangs of Jews dynamited the area security office in Tel Aviv, causing several deaths. Without delay, suspected persons are rounded up and identity papers carefully checked. Another danger spot, the suburb of Ramat Gan, is put under curfew, while the entire male population is kept under observation by troops and police. A grave and growing problem for the London Conference and for the world.
After a bomb explosion caused by terrorists on the British headquarters at Jerusalem, one entire corner of the King David Hotel, a building of 7 stories, was razed to the ground. The stone floors were cut clean.
In scenes eerily reminiscent of New York 55 years later, the Jerusalem bomb was the beginning of terrorism as a media event, designed to capture the world's attention.
The latest casualty list included 65 killed, 47 injured.
The perpetrators, Zionist Jews, members of Menachem Begin's Irgun terrorist network. Begin, who would one day become Prime Minister of Israel, described this tactic as turning Palestine into a glass house, where the entire world was looking in.
I think it was one of these acts of violence that ahead of its time, I mean in an era before CNN, before instantaneous news, was choreographed precisely to attract international attention.
We were a minority, but we were a minority with a clear ideology that we must have a Jewish state to rebuild the state which was existing many, many hundreds of years ago.
The bombing of the King David Hotel was perhaps one of the most significant terrorist incidents of the 20th century. For many decades, it actually held the infamous record of having killed the largest number of people.
In a fight for liberty, you have always those who are more, call them extreme, or more adamant, or call them staunch, and they want it immediately, not to wait for the Messiah.
Still lying under the shadow of terrorist attacks, many areas of Palestine had...
By the end of World War II, the British, who had been made responsible for looking after Palestine by the old League of Nations 27 years earlier, found it to be a serious headache. They were caught in the middle of the Arabs and the Jews, both of whom wanted the country for their own, were unwilling to peacefully coexist, and were agreed on only one thing: their hatred of the British, whom they both saw as foreign occupiers. The British military and administrative headquarters was here, in the south wing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. The luxury hotel itself still functioned with guests, restaurants, bars, and Sudanese waiters.
Jerusalem at that time, it was a fortress, and I walk through the town and put in my mind every place and think about how can we attack this place. If we succeed, it's very important the whole world will see that we can fight even the British.
Begin and Ellis decided on a daring plan. They would strike at the very heart of British rule, the King David Hotel itself. If they succeeded here, the whole world would take notice. The terrorist bomb was hidden in 7 milk churns and delivered in a hijacked pickup truck to the hotel's basement kitchen.
We jumped out and everyone took up their positions. I took the churn and started to run. I was thinking, how do I get to the place where I have to put the churn down? That's how I started. Anyway, there were lots of people around in the corridor, and we tried to move them out of the way. Here, there, to the side. But there were some who resisted, but we threatened them with our weapons. I wasn't dressed as a civilian or a soldier. I was dressed like an Arab, with a jalaba and a keffiyeh, with that ring on your head. You know, like, what's he called? The leader of the Arabs. You know, Arafat. There were 7 churns, weighing 350 kilos in all. I ran until I reached the place where I had to put it down, with the churn on my shoulder. I carried on, until I got to the place where the British people were. I saw a pillar that used to be here, and I put the churn down and ran away immediately. I waited in my position until all the churns were together, and then the time would come for the explosion. All the churns together were like one whole man, a complete bomb.
The bomb went off at 12:37 and was devastating. But of the 91 dead, only 28 were British. 17 Jews died alongside 41 Arabs. Of all these, 54 were innocent civilians, unconnected to the British authorities in any way.
It's classic terror in that it's off the mainstream. It's not a reflection of the policies of the then Israeli leadership, which had a very strong ethical approach to the use of violence, admirable in many ways. And it shows, too, a sign of the future in that it's the damage being done by the splinter of the main movement.
Opinion. In 1948, the British Chief Secretary in Palestine, Sir Henry Gurney, wrote in his diary of how one Irgun attack was indiscriminately aimed at civilian targets and was designed to create panic among the population. 3 years later, Gurney himself was to be assassinated, as liberation movements all over the world took note of the flame that had been ignited in Palestine. By 1948, the British and the world community had lost their appetite for the fight against the Jewish terrorists, and the British abandoned Palestine, leaving Arab and Jew to fight it out amongst themselves. But elsewhere in their restless colonies, others had watched and learnt from the success of the Zionist terrorists.
I want to emphasize that as our time starts winding down for today, I want to emphasize that, and of course, as you can tell, these presentations are being brought by the British, so they have one perspective. The actual history, I had actually had the opportunity. There was a small group of us, about 12 of us, who got to meet Gidi Poglin, Amichai Poglin, who was the bomb maker of the Irgun, who created the bombs that blew up the King David Hotel. And we had the opportunity to spend a good hour with him. He taught us how to make those bombs. Haven't done it since because I don't like milk so much. The thing is that they had determined, it turned out they had the guy who was the architect of the King David Hotel, the Jewish guy in Israel, Palestine. He happened to be an Irgun supporter. He wasn't an Irgun fighter, but his heart was with the Irgun. So he shared the architectural plans of the building with the Irgun and with Poglin, who was the chief bomb maker. And as you saw in the film clips, they determined that the weak spot in the building was that particular set of pillars. And if they could knock out the pillar, they would knock out that whole southern wing. Why the southern wing? The British, having control of Palestine or Israel, had to have a central command. And that's where the central headquarters were for the entire region of Eretz Yisrael or Palestine, that southern wing. They kept all their documents there. When they arrested people, all their records were there. Remember, those are the days before computers. So all records are kept in paper, what we call hard copy nowadays. We don't even have that term back then because there was no such thing as soft copy. And consequently, all the records, all their investigations, pictures and photographs of Irgun people that were wanted, everything was there. And so if you could somehow destroy the southern wing of the King David Hotel, you would be doing a lot more than what the two little newsreel documentaries showed. You would not only be reaching the world and sending a message to the world, and sending a message to the people of Britain. Do you really want your sons staying here in our land, possibly getting killed? And sending a message to America, to Jews in America, and sending a message to the UN. But also what there was practically happening is they were destroying the records of all the investigations and all the intelligence that the British had on the Irgun and the Lechi and the so-called Stern Gang, the Lochamei Cherut Yisrael. And the day of the bombing, you don't really pick it up much in these documentary clips. 3 separate phone calls were made to the central command at the King David Hotel in advance in order to get people out. It was different from terrorism that often is associated, whether with Arabs or in Ethiopia and the Sudan, or among the Chechens, or other type of people, there's a Jewish sense that you don't want to hurt civilians. You don't want to, even the modern day Israel this week, fighting back in Gaza against Hamas and Islamic Jihad, trying to target their assassinations of jihadi leaders and minimize casualties among civilians. And so the Irgun wanted to minimize casualties among civilians. They called 3 different times, and the commander in charge gave orders, no one is allowed to leave. The famous quote was, "We came here to give orders to the Jews. We're not here to take orders from the Jews." So when people wanted to leave the building, the British actually sealed off, they locked doors and exits, preventing their own staff and employees from leaving the building in an abundance of caution, because they wanted to make clear, we don't take orders from the Jews. And the Irgun made every effort to get them out and to warn them. They didn't tell them where the bomb was, but to say, you got to get out because that place is coming down in 5 minutes and 10 minutes. In the end, when the bomb came, the commanding officer in the Irgun who had given the orders no one is to leave, he had left. He and his top small inner brass, he saw to it that they left, but he kept all the others behind. That doesn't come out in the documentary story. And so when that bombing took place, it changed the entire equation, even in terms of the Jewish underground in its relationship with the British. It showed the British it's no longer about a bombing of a police station here, a hold up at a bank to get some money to buy new weapons, but that this is serious stuff on a whole new level. You're fighting against people that are going to take down your command here. And so next week, in our last class on this subject, the 4th of our 4 parts, we'll have more clips. We're also going to talk about the 2 most really shocking assassinations that took place during this period. We're going to get a bit into the Lechi, the 3rd of those groups, what the British called the Sternists, or the Stern Gang, because it was named for Abraham Stern. And the Lechi targeted, among other people, they targeted Lord Moyne, who was in charge of the British area in Palestine, whereas there was a guy in charge, let's say, at the King David Hotel of that headquarters. Lord Moyne was in charge of the whole British operation. And it was in his hands to either deny the Jews the right to allow Jews to come in. It was within his hands to seal off the Haifa ports or to let the Jews in. And very famously, he was quoted as having told a man named Joel Brand, it's another story, when Joel Brand, according to this story, had been a representative of the Jewish agency, saying, we would like to negotiate something to bring more Jews in. Lord Moyne said, whatever will I do with another 1 million Jews? And so the Lechi decided he has to be assassinated. And later, Count Folke Bernadotte. Folke Bernadotte was sent as a representative of the United Nations in 1947. He was sent to survey the area in Palestine, namely Israel. We have already learned together how the British truncated 78% and then more and more and more. And on the eve of Israel becoming an independent country, the United Nations planned one more further division of Israel into even smaller than the little itsy bitsy they were still letting us have. They were going to cut it down one more time. Folke Bernadotte came to Israel and he gave press conferences. He held press conferences where he said that every Arab should be, who wants to come back, should be able to come back in there. And the Lechi decided he also has to go. We'll cover it more next week, God willing, in the 4th and concluding part of our 4-part series. Thank you very much for being here. And really, this has been really exciting for me also to put this material together. And as I've told you, the reason we timed it was we started at the time of Yom Ha'atzmaut, the Israel Independence Day, and we're running it towards Chavchet Iyar, which is Jerusalem Day, the anniversary of June 1967, when Israel liberated and unified Jerusalem. And as it happens, today is May 14th, which on the secular calendar is when the State of Israel was created and declared. Thank you so very much.